It started on a morning that seemed ordinary, almost serene. The sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, painting the room in golden hues, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel that life was simple and safe. Ryan was already in the kitchen, humming softly as he prepared coffee, the steam rising in delicate curls. I watched him from the doorway, the familiar warmth of routine wrapping around me like a blanket. He turned toward me and smiled, that effortless, charming smile I had once thought belonged only to me. At that instant, I felt a deep comfort, a certainty that nothing could shake the world we had built. I was wrong. The first signs were so subtle I almost didn't notice them. A glance that lingered on his phone a moment too long, a text he hid from view, a laugh that seemed forced, a hesitation in his voice when I asked casual questions. They were tiny cracks in what I had always believed to be unshakable trust, but together they formed a pattern that my heart recognized before my mind did. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a coincidence, a misreading, but intuition is stubborn, and mine whispered insistently, "Something is wrong." I began paying attention, quietly, as one watches a delicate glass balanced on a ledge. Every gesture, every word, every glance became a clue. Slowly, suspicion unfurled like smoke in a room, subtle, pervasive, and impossible to ignore. I replayed interactions in my head, examining every detail, every nuance. The things I had once overlooked now screamed for attention. Then came the first concrete evidence, small, almost innocuous, but undeniable. One evening, as we watched a movie together on the couch, his phone buzzed. I noticed it immediately. He reached for it instinctively, but this time he faltered. I pretended not to notice, but I observed everything. The quick glance around the room, the way his fingers hesitated, the micro-expression that passed fleetingly across his face before he masked it. That moment, brief as it was, confirmed the gnawing suspicion that had been growing for weeks. My heart felt heavy, but I didn't act impulsively. I couldn't. Acting too soon would give him the power to manipulate, to deny, to twist the story. I had to be certain, and more importantly, I had to be ready. Revenge, I realized, wouldn't come from anger or tears. It would come from control, from patience, from a calculated understanding of the man who had betrayed me. Over the next few days, I became an observer in my own life. I watched him closely, noting patterns and inconsistencies. He would often disappear for hours with vague explanations. Work, running errands, meeting a friend, each excuse feeling increasingly hollow. His phone was never far from him, always face down, always guarded. Messages were answered quickly, then deleted with care. And yet, his expressions sometimes betrayed him. A twitch of a smile, a flicker of guilt, a momentary hesitation, small windows into the truth I sought. It was during one quiet evening that I discovered the first undeniable proof. His phone lit up with a message he thought I would never see. The name wasn't familiar, and the message itself was intimate, casual, warm. The kind of message one doesn't send to a friend, the kind reserved for someone they want closer than they should. I froze. My hands trembled, not with rage, but with a chilling clarity. My life had been running parallel to a secret he had built meticulously, carefully, and I had been blind to it. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't demand explanations. I sat quietly, letting the weight of realizations settle in. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with a dramatic moment. Sometimes it comes softly, creeping into your heart and turning familiar warmth into hollow emptiness. The shock is silent, but its impact echoes endlessly. For days, I observed him with even more scrutiny. Every deviation from routine became a thread I could follow. Every casual lie, every hidden smile, every unexplained absence was another piece of the puzzle. I didn't want to act without knowing the full picture. I needed clarity, and I needed control. Friends began noticing the tension in me. I smiled when necessary, laughed when expected, and spoke with a casual tone that concealed the storm inside. They didn't know the full extent of what was happening, and I made sure they didn't. This was my battle alone. Betrayal is intimate, and the consequences must be met with careful precision, not public spectacle. One night, as I lay awake beside him, I reflected on the months that had led to this moment. I remembered the first time I had trusted him completely, the first time I had shared my dreams, my fears, my vulnerabilities. And I remembered how effortlessly he had dismantled that trust, how easily he had hidden a second life from me. The pain was acute, but beneath it, a sense of determination began to grow. I realized that my response would define me, not him. He had chosen a path that betrayed love, respect, and loyalty. I could respond in anger, allow myself to be consumed by grief, or I could act with calculated precision and dignity. I chose the latter. For the next few weeks, I became both observer and strategist. I documented everything in my mind, noting patterns, habits, and inconsistencies. I learned when he would check his phone, how he spoke to this other person, the timing of their communications. Each detail was a brushstroke in a portrait of deceit. I also learned to control my emotions. Every urge to confront, to cry, to explode was noted and set aside. True power, I realized, comes from restraint. Every reaction, every display of emotion must be measured and deliberate. Only then can one turn betrayal into empowerment. Then came the day when I caught him in a lie I could no longer ignore. A receipt in his pocket, an unfamiliar perfume on his clothes, an explanation that didn't match reality. My heart sank, but I remained outwardly calm. He didn't suspect that I had pieced together the evidence, that I had observed the signs, that I had been preparing. I confronted him gently at first. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice steady, controlled. His face faltered. His excuses stumbled. Words that had once flowed effortlessly became clumsy, inadequate. And in that moment, I understood the true scope of his betrayal. He had built a life of deception in parallel with the one we shared. I didn't respond with anger. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply listened, absorbing the truth in its entirety. And as I listened, I felt a transformation within myself. The helplessness, the heartbreak, the doubt, all of it began to crystallize into clarity. I realized then that revenge isn't about immediate retaliation. It isn't about confrontation or chaos. True revenge is calculated, deliberate, and precise. It is about reclaiming control, dignity, and power from someone who tried to take them from you. Over the following days, I developed a plan, a quiet, careful psychological strategy that would expose the betrayal fully, reveal the lies, and allow me to walk away with my head held high. I observed him as I had before, but now with a sharper focus, a keener sense of purpose. Every conversation, every glance, every reaction was noted, cataloged, and analyzed. I began small experiments, casual questions about loyalty, innocent remarks about honesty, subtle references to trust, all designed to observe his reactions without revealing my awareness. Each slight twitch of the eye, each hesitation in speech, each fleeting change in demeanor was confirmation that he was aware I was no longer naive. I also considered my own demeanor. I needed to appear unaffected, almost naive, even as I had complete awareness. The mask of vulnerability was essential. He had underestimated me once, and I intended to make sure he never did so again. Night after night, I rehearsed the eventual confrontation in my mind. I imagined the words I would say, the evidence I would present, the moment when he would finally understand the consequences of his actions. Timing, tone, expression, everything had to be perfect. This wasn't just about him learning the truth, it was about reclaiming my narrative, my power, my life. By the end of the third week, I had the full scope of his betrayal mapped out in my mind. I knew every lie, every deception, every hidden communication, and I knew exactly when, how, and where I would reveal it all. I also reflected on my own growth. The betrayal had forced me to become patient, observant, and strategic. It had awakened a resilience I didn't know I possessed. The woman who had been blindsided, naive, and trusting had transformed into someone capable of reclaiming her life with dignity and strength. The storm was approaching, though outwardly, life continued. I smiled when he entered the room, laughed when appropriate, and maintained the facade of normalcy. Each day brought small moments of psychological tension as he began to sense, without knowing exactly why, that I was no longer naive. I reminded myself constantly, patience is power, clarity is strength, timing is everything, and when the moment came, it would be unforgettable. Then, one quiet evening, he came home, smiling, unsuspecting, believing that life had returned to its ordinary rhythm. I greeted him warmly, but my mind was sharp, alert, aware of every nuance. He didn't know the depth of my observation, the extent of my awareness, or the precision of my plan. I had everything I needed, every detail documented mentally, every pattern observed, every reaction rehearsed. And now, the moment of action was approaching, the culmination of weeks of quiet preparation, reflection, and strategy. The days that followed were calm on the surface, but beneath that calm, everything was shifting. Life went on, as it always does, with ordinary routines, quiet breakfasts, and casual conversations. But I was no longer living in ordinary. Every glance he gave, every word he spoke, every subtle gesture became part of a carefully constructed map of his deception. And I, silent and deliberate, was mapping it all with precision. I knew that reaction without strategy would accomplish nothing. Rage is fleeting. Anger fades. But control, awareness, and timing, those are permanent. So I embraced patience like a weapon. I smiled at him in the mornings, laughed at his jokes, and kissed him on the cheek, all the while feeling a strange thrill of empowerment. He had underestimated me once, and that mistake would become his undoing. I began rehearsing my demeanor, calm, composed, unaffected, almost naive, a mask to lull him into the illusion that I was still unaware. But inside, my mind was alive, observing, cataloging, and planning. The mask of vulnerability would allow me to control the narrative, to control the moment when everything would be revealed. Every evening, I reflected on his habits, noting the timing of his calls, the subtle tones in his voice, the way he avoided eye contact at certain moments. I built mental scenarios. If he lied, what would his hesitation look like? If he tried to manipulate me, how would he react? Every possible outcome was rehearsed, every escape route anticipated. I also began to gather evidence, carefully, quietly, not in a confrontational way, no need to burn bridges prematurely, but enough to ensure that when the moment arrived, I could reveal everything without dispute. Receipts, messages, timestamps, and inconsistencies were all noted. Every piece of information became a thread, and soon I would weave a tapestry that he could not deny. The psychological game began subtly. I asked casual questions about loyalty and honesty in hypothetical situations. I made remarks about relationships, trust, and transparency, never accusatory, only thoughtful and reflective. Each response from him was telling. A slight flinch, a hesitation, a fleeting look, small signs of guilt that confirmed the web of deceit I had already suspected. I started documenting these signs mentally, creating a complete picture of his behavior. I observed his reactions to minor triggers, noting the moments when he grew uncomfortable or defensive. Each micro-expression, each subtle tone change became evidence of his duplicity, strengthening the foundation of the plan I was building. I also reflected on my own emotions. The pain of betrayal was ever present, like a shadow, but it no longer controlled me. I transformed it into clarity and resolve. Every pang of hurt was now fuel for my strategy. Every sleepless night a rehearsal for the confrontation that would come. I realized that strength is not the absence of pain, but the ability to act purposefully despite it. In parallel, I cultivated my personal power. I focused on my work, my health, and my social connections. I rebuilt the confidence that had been eroded by deception. This was crucial. The ultimate confrontation would not just reveal his betrayal, it would demonstrate my own transformation, my rise from pain to empowerment. The preparation wasn't only mental. I began creating subtle environmental cues, notes left in plain sight, casual references to honesty in conversation, and mentions of trustworthiness in front of friends and family. These weren't confrontations, they were gentle nudges, psychological probes to gauge his reactions and to plant the idea that his secrecy would not go unnoticed. And then came the first deliberate test. One evening, I left a trace of information where he would see it, not directly accusatory, just a small piece of the puzzle, enough to spark curiosity, enough to stir unease. I watched him carefully, noting his immediate reaction. A flicker of hesitation, a tightening of his jaw, a momentary pause. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I saw it, cataloged it, and knew the strategy was working. As the days passed, the psychological tension grew. He began to sense that I was no longer naive, that my awareness had sharpened, though he couldn't pinpoint how. He started making small missteps, tiny slips in communication, evidence left carelessly. And I observed it all, quietly, steadily, like a predator calculating the final strike. I also rehearsed the eventual confrontation in my mind. I visualized the moment I would reveal everything, the calm and collected way I would present the evidence, the subtle yet undeniable impact of the truth. Timing, tone, expression, every detail was meticulously crafted. This wasn't about revenge for the sake of anger. It was about justice, clarity, and reclaiming control. During this period, I noticed a shift in myself. I no longer felt consumed by hurt or confusion. Instead, a profound sense of empowerment grew within me. The betrayal had forced me to become vigilant, patient, and strategic. It had honed my awareness, sharpened my intellect, and strengthened my emotional resilience. I realized that true power lies not in reacting impulsively, but in acting deliberately. Friends began commenting on my composure. "You seem different," one said casually. I smiled, acknowledging the observation without revealing the depth of my internal transformation. The subtle confidence I exuded was a direct result of the plan I had cultivated, a quiet assertion that I was no longer the person who could be easily deceived. I also began considering contingencies. What if he tried to manipulate me once confronted? What if he denied everything? What if he attempted to shift blame or sow doubt? I anticipated each possibility, rehearsed my responses, and prepared countermeasures. Every scenario was accounted for, every reaction considered, ensuring that when the moment came, there would be no room for escape or denial. Then, one evening, I took a deeper step. I planted subtle evidence, a document, a casual mention of a meeting he had forgotten, a tiny inconsistency I knew he would notice. The psychological effect was immediate. He glanced at me with a flicker of unease, a momentary tension in his posture. That small shift thrilled me in a way I hadn't expected. The balance of power had subtly shifted, and he was beginning to feel it. Even then, I maintained my calm. I smiled, engaged him in conversation, and continued our ordinary routines, all while the tension simmered beneath the surface. This was the art of psychological precision, allowing the betrayer to feel the weight of their deception without overt confrontation, creating a slow-building anticipation that would culminate in a moment of undeniable clarity. I began rehearsing my language, the cadence of my words, and the timing of my delivery. The eventual confrontation had to be flawless, not just in content, but in emotional impact. I imagined the moment he would realize the extent of his betrayal, the subtle shifts in his expression, the hesitation in his voice, and the recognition that he had underestimated me. During this period, I also reflected on my own transformation. The betrayal had forced me to cultivate patience, strategic thinking, and emotional control. I realized that the woman who had once been blindsided, who had trusted blindly, was gone. In her place was someone who had harnessed pain into power, hurt into clarity, and deception into strategy. Days turned into weeks. I continued the delicate dance of observation and subtle provocation. Every interaction was measured, every smile and laugh calculated. He remained unaware of the depth of my awareness, but the tension grew like an invisible weight between us. I could sense it in his gestures, his tone, his fleeting expressions, proof that my psychological strategy was working. Then came the night when I knew the culmination was near. The small signs, the subtle evidence, the careful observation, all had converged. I had created an environment where he was vulnerable, where the full revelation would hit with undeniable clarity. Every preparation, every mental rehearsal, every piece of subtle manipulation had led to this moment. I sat quietly in the living room, notebook in hand, reviewing the evidence I had accumulated. Messages, receipts, inconsistencies, patterns. I visualized the confrontation in every detail, my posture, my tone, my expressions, the timing of each reveal. The plan was perfect. The execution would be precise, and he would have no way to deny or escape the truth. The thrill of anticipation was electric, but I remained outwardly calm. The mask of vulnerability, of naivety, was flawless. He believed he had the advantage, unaware that I had orchestrated every step leading to this moment, and when the moment arrived, the impact would be absolute. I reminded myself constantly, patience is power, awareness is strength, timing is everything, and when I acted, it would not be out of anger or spite. It would be a demonstration of clarity, justice, and the reclaiming of control. And so, the calm before the storm ended. The preparation was complete. The subtle execution had begun. Every detail was in place, every reaction anticipated, and the final revelation was imminent. The betrayer would finally understand, in a way he could not ignore, the full weight of his deception, and I would emerge unbroken, empowered, and in full control of my life. The day had finally arrived. After weeks of careful observation, subtle provocations, and meticulous planning, the moment of confrontation was at hand. Every detail had been anticipated, every reaction rehearsed, and I, calm and composed, was ready to reclaim control of my life. I prepared the room carefully, soft lighting, warm and inviting, with the table set as if nothing unusual was about to happen. A quiet tension hung in the air, invisible yet palpable. Ryan walked in, smiling, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. I greeted him warmly, kissed him on the cheek, and offered him a seat at the table. "Dinner looks great," he said casually, his tone relaxed. He had no idea that everything he thought he had concealed was about to be exposed. I smiled. "Thank you," I replied, my voice calm and steady, betraying none of the anticipation inside me. The mask was perfect. He believed that I was still the woman who trusted him implicitly, who had no inkling of the web of deceit he had spun. I took a deep breath and placed my phone on the table. With deliberate calm, I pressed play. Messages, voice notes, receipts, evidence, every piece of proof meticulously collected over weeks of observation began to display. His smile faltered almost immediately. Eyes widened, mouth opening slightly, as disbelief and panic began to creep in. I can explain," he stammered, his voice cracking. But I stayed silent, letting the evidence speak for itself. Every lie, every omission, every betrayal he had thought hidden now lay bare before him. His defenses kicked in, quickly and poorly rehearsed. Excuses, denials, and misplaced blame spilled out in a torrent, but none of it held up. Each claim was met with calm, collected evidence, each explanation dismantled with precision. I did not shout, I did not cry. I simply observed, letting the impact of the truth unfold naturally. As he grew more desperate, I felt a strange sense of relief, not revenge as he might imagine it, but relief at reclaiming clarity and control. The fear and uncertainty that had haunted me were gone, replaced by empowerment. The woman who had once been blindsided and naive was gone. In her place stood someone unshakable, deliberate, and in full command of her life. When the storm of his panic had subsided, I looked him in the eyes, steady and unwavering. "I don't hate you," I said softly. "I'm just done allowing you to hurt me." He sank back into his chair, defeated, speechless. No excuses left, no lies to hide behind. The full weight of his betrayal had finally landed, and he could no longer deny it. I stood, my posture calm and commanding. "This," I continued, gesturing to the evidence on the phone, "is the truth you tried to hide. And now it's here, not for anyone else, not for humiliation, but so that you understand, actions have consequences, lies have consequences, betrayal has consequences." I walked out of the room, leaving him to process the reality of his choices. There was no need for further argument, no need for confrontation beyond the undeniable proof laid before him. My response had been delivered with precision, dignity, and control. The most unforgettable response I could have given. In the days that followed, I focused entirely on rebuilding myself. Each morning, I reminded myself that life had given me a chance to rise stronger, to reclaim the parts of myself that had been diminished by deceit. I returned to passions I had neglected, to friendships I had put aside, and to dreams I had buried under the weight of trust broken. The betrayal had forced me into transformation. The pain had honed my resilience. The deceit had sharpened my awareness. And in this crucible of adversity, I discovered strength I hadn't known I possessed. I began to appreciate the subtle joys of independence, the quiet satisfaction of self-respect, and the profound empowerment that comes from standing tall after being wronged. My confidence grew, not from the defeat of someone else, but from the reclamation of my own life. I also reflected deeply on the nature of betrayal. Trust, once broken, leaves scars, but it also teaches lessons. Loyalty cannot be forced, respect cannot be demanded. The person who chooses to deceive may never fully grasp the pain they inflict, but the betrayed can transform that pain into growth. In time, the memories of his betrayal became just that, memories, not burdens, not chains, not shadows haunting my days, but markers of lessons learned, reminders of the woman I had become. I no longer felt anger when I thought of him. I felt clarity, I felt strength, I felt freedom. And then, one morning, I realized something profound. The most unforgettable response to betrayal is not revenge in its traditional sense. It is self-reclamation, it is dignity. It is walking away, empowered and unbroken, leaving the deceiver to face the emptiness they have created. I began to share my story quietly with close friends, not to boast, but to illustrate the power of patience, awareness, and calculated action. I spoke of the transformation that comes from adversity, the resilience that emerges from pain, and the clarity that follows betrayal. Each recounting reinforced my understanding that true empowerment comes from within. Eventually, the day came when I no longer thought of him daily. The pain had dulled, the betrayal had faded into a background lesson, and my life had expanded into spaces of freedom, joy, and fulfillment that I hadn't known existed. I realized that being betrayed does not define a person. How they respond does. And in that response, I had found not just closure, but empowerment, clarity, and peace. I reflected on the journey. The quiet mornings of suspicion, the nights of restless observation, the deliberate psychological strategies, and the final confrontation. All of it had shaped me into a stronger, wiser, and more resilient woman. I had learned to trust my instincts, to harness my emotions, and to act with purpose. In the end, I understood that betrayal is a test, not of the deceiver, but of the betrayed. And passing that test requires patience, clarity, and self-respect. It requires transforming pain into power, disappointment into insight, and betrayal into an opportunity for growth. The man who had betrayed me became a lesson, a turning point, not a defining chapter. The woman I became in response, empowered, aware, and dignified, became the story itself. I found joy again, not in vengeance, not in retaliation, but in the simple reclaiming of my life. Every morning, every decision, every smile was a reaffirmation of my independence, my worth, and my strength. I was no longer defined by his actions, but by my own response, by the clarity and courage with which I had faced the storm. And in that clarity, I discovered freedom, the most profound, empowering, and unforgettable freedom of all. Because the true lesson of betrayal is not how deeply it hurts, but how profoundly it can transform. And in that transformation, I found not only closure, but a life far greater than I had ever imagined. I no longer feared deception, heartbreak, or loss. Instead, I embraced the certainty that I could face any challenge, endure any pain, and emerge stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The betrayal had not broken me, it had built me. And that ultimately became my unforgettable response. I walked into the sunlight of my own life, fully aware of the woman I had become, confident, empowered, and free. The past existed only as a lesson. The future was mine to shape, and I realized, with a profound sense of peace, that some betrayals do not mark the end of a story. They mark the beginning of transformation, strength, and self-respect. In the end, I understood the simplest and most powerful truth. The most unforgettable revenge is the one that transforms pain into empowerment, betrayal into clarity, and heartbreak into the unshakable strength of self-worth. And that is the story of how I turned betrayal into my greatest victory, not by tearing someone down, but by rising above, reclaiming my life, and becoming the woman I was always meant to be.